welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Today we look at HM Prison Chelmsford. Her Majesty's Prison Chelmsford is a Category B men's prison and young offenders institution located in Chelmsford, Essex. The prison is operated by Her Majesty's Prison Service. Chelmsford began as a county jail in 1825 before transforming into a Category B prison, a young person's prison and a local prison. 1825, the newly completed Springfield prison, where some 43 individuals fell victim of the executioner's rope in the years up to the end of 1914. The prison's main entrance was originally through an austere stone-built Pofter's Lodge in the middle of the Springfield Road frontage. The lodge's flat roof was designed to support the gallows, scaffold and drop, while the forecourt could easily accommodate the hundreds and sometimes thousands of spectators that would congregate for an execution. The first private execution at Springfield was that of Michael Campbell. The 28-year-old Berwick-born tailor and former soldier was convicted of murder of Samuel Galloway, a retired dock worker in Stratford. In 1999, the management at Chelmsford Prison was severely criticised by the Chief Inspector of Prisons after finding that staff were failing to respond to cell alarms 5 years after a prisoner was beaten to death by his cellmate. The prison was also criticised for unacceptably bad conditions of uncleanliness. A further inspection a year later confirmed these failings at the prison. In 2002, conditions at Chelmsford were condemned as poor and cramped by the Goals Board of Visitors. However, in 2005, Chelmsford was praised in its inspection for improving standards and procedures for inmates at the prison. On the 25th of December 2007, 18-year-old Abdullah Hagar Idris hanged himself in the prison after he was told that he was going to be deported. In January 2013, the Ministry of Justice announced that the older parts of Chelmsford Prison will close, with a reduction of 132 places. In December 2015, a riot led to 6 members of staff needing hospital treatment. Education at the prison is contracted to Milton Keynes College, and courses offered include literacy, numeracy, information technology, art, barbering, journalism, cookery, ESOL, as well as social life and programs. The prison's gym also offers physical education with industry-related qualifications, as well as recreational gym. In addition, the prison has links to and facilities provided by organisations such as the Job Centre and the Samaritans. There is also a prison visitor centre operated by the Ormiston Children and Families Trust. Staffing at the prison has been reduced by 25%. According to the Independent Monitoring Board, bullying, violence and self-harm have increased markedly at the prison due to staff shortages. Budget cuts and the inability of the prison service to recruit and retain staff led to fears for the prison's safety. The prison is becoming more dangerous and less effective. Prison healthcare provided by Care UK is considered poor. There were delays in getting medication and reliance on agency staff to fill vacancies. There is insufficient secure mental health accommodation outside the prison for the most vulnerable inmates. The Independent Monitoring Board stated that the level of service being provided to care for prisoners' physical and mental health needs remains inadequate. Due to staff shortages, the staff were unable to provide engagement work or education for prisoners. Illegal drugs are a problem. Use of force by staff is increasing, and there is insufficient monitoring if this use is appropriate. Following the death of a vulnerable inmate in January 2017 and criticism from the prison ombudsman, Care UK announced it would end its healthcare contract there, as the level of the resource the prison service made available was insufficient. Drug use is a serious problem at Chelmsford, according to HM Inspectorate of Prisons. 42.6% of prisoners failed drug tests, and organised gangs supplied prohibited items. Inspectors described significant concerns about safety and excessive levels of violence. Much of the violence is due to supply and the use of prohibited substances. Peter Clark said that the rising violence, suicides, and accessibility of drugs and bad living conditions made him consider using the urgent notification protocol, which would make the Justice Secretary take action. In 1 month, prison authorities seized £15,000 worth of illegal goods. There were 17 suicides at Chelmsford during the 8 years to 2018, and 5 of them were since the inspection in 2016. Deborah Coles of Inquest said the prison was incredibly unsafe due to the rate of suicides, and said that it suggested the plethora of recommendations following previous self-inflicted deaths have not been implemented. Recent inquests into deaths at Chelmsford Prison have highlighted failures around the management of self-harm procedures, a lack of staff training in mental health awareness, inadequate risk assessments and failures in responding to bullying. The failure to implement existing guidelines on the care of those at risk indicates a lack of care, neglect and inhumane treatment from punitive and often inflexible prison regimes. Problems inspectors drew attention to included that 40% of prisoners who did not take part in activities were locked up in their cells for 22 hours a day, and items including mattresses and pillows were in short supply. The Howard League for Penal Reform maintained that Chelmsford was designed to hold 521 men, but the prison actually held 700 men when it was inspected. Dean Saunders, 25, killed himself at Chelmsford in January 2016. An inquest jury found that Saunders was downgraded from continuous watch to half-hour checks for financial reasons, and neglect contributed to his death. Care UK, a private company running healthcare at Chelmsford, treated financial consideration as a significant reason to reduce the level of observations, although they were warned repeatedly about Dean's mental condition. Dean's mother pleaded with staff to keep him under constant watch. The jury stated that Mr. Saunders and his family were let down by serious failings by mental health services and the prison system, and that the assessing his mental health needs was not adequately conducted, with multiple failings in recording and passing on information. Dean's family stated that hospital, not prison, is where Dean deserved to be and needed to be. We as a family, together with our lawyers and inquest, want Dean's death to mark the end of empty promises and a start of change. The prison ombudsman also found significant risk factors were ignored when observation of Dean Saunders was cut back. He found those trying to care for Dean felt that he should be in a mental health facility rather than prison. He added that I am also concerned that there appears to have been some confusion at Chelmsford about the process for transferring mentally ill prisoners to hospital, which meant that an opportunity to transfer Mr. Saunders in December of 2015 was missed. Sadly, the criminal justice system did too little to protect this very vulnerable man. Dean's father, Mark Saunders, said, "There was no proper medical structure there. We were lied to and misled all the way through. We were devastated." In 1990, former professional footballer Tony Adams spent 57 days of a 4-month sentence in HMP Chelmsford for drink driving. The 1979 film Porridge, a film version of the Porridge TV series, was filmed almost entirely on location at Chelmsford Prison. The punk rock band the Sex Pistols recorded a live album at the Chelmsford Prison called Live at the Chelmsford Top Security Prison. Chelmsford was built in the 1830s as a county jail close to the centre of Chelmsford. 2 new residential units were opened in 1996, E and F wings, to relieve overcrowding, and a 3rd unit, G wing, was opened in 2006. It serves courts in Essex, taking men whose homes are mainly in the Essex area. It holds those who are sentenced on remand or on trial, and it holds adults, some young adults, and also foreign national prisoners. The oldest part of the establishment houses 4 wings, A, B, C and D wing, off a central hub with E, F and G being opened more recently. A wing includes the segregation unit. B wing is an induction and general population unit. C wing and D wing are also general population units. E wing is the integrated drug treatment unit. F wing is general population, and G wing is housing for vulnerable and enhanced prisoners. The newer part of the prison has a 12-bed, 24-hour healthcare unit. The prison has a Samaritan support listener scheme in place for prisoners who are in distress or who need to talk in confidence. Specialist organisations are based within the prison, forming part of the Reducing Reoffending agenda to actively engage prisoners with all elements of resettlement. These include Narco, CTEC, the Job Centre Plus, Ormiston Children's and Families Trust, and Inside Out. Assistance is available on a wide range of issues: money and debt guidance, help to open a bank account, drug and alcohol interventions, multi-agency resettlement and pre-release clinics, job clubs, and developing ties with prisoners and their children through storytime learning and children's visits initiatives. Partnerships are also held with external companies helping to drive education and employment opportunities in preparation for release. The Safer Custody Helpline is an answer machine service that can be used by prisoners or their families to report bullying or to report concerns about self-harm or suicide or any other safer custody issue. Healthcare is provided by the NHS via North Essex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust in a purpose-built facility within the prison, in the newer part of the prison. It has a 12-bed, 24-hour healthcare unit. The prison inspectors have made a follow-up IRP to Chelmsford after their inspection in May 2018. In the summary of their report, they said, "At our inspection of HMP Chelmsford in May to June 2018, we made the following judgment about outcomes for our prisoners. The safety was poor and not sufficiently good in 2016. Rehabilitation and release planning was reasonably good and previously was sufficiently good. HMP Chelmsford is a medium-sized local prison holding prisoners on remand and sentence. It had an operational capacity of over 700, but at the time of this review visit, the population had been reduced by about 60 to enable the refurbishment of some wings." However, this reduction was a temporary measure, and we were told that HMPPS would increase the population in the very near future. As the prison was overcrowded, even with the reduced population, we had major concerns about the return to the unacceptable overcrowding we saw last year, and the inevitable impact of this, particularly on the safety and decency of everyone. The last full inspection was carried out in June 2018, and we had key concerns in many areas of our healthy prison tests, which had persisted and even deteriorated in some areas since the previous inspection in 2016. We gave our lowest possible judgment on safety because of several major concerns. For example, the level of violence was very high and some was serious. There was a lack of insight into the causes of violence and little action taken to reduce it, despite a desire by staff to make improvements. Illicit drugs and other banned items were easy to obtain, and the mandatory drug testing MDT rate was one of the highest recorded in England and Wales. Prisoners at risk of self-harm were not managed well enough, and there had been a high number of self-inflicted deaths, 16 in the previous 8 years. The living conditions for prisoners were mixed, and there were unacceptable standards of cleanliness and lack of access to some very basic items. Healthcare leadership needed improving, and some important areas of the provision needed urgent attention. Purposeful activity also received our lowest judgment. The lack of time out of cell, with many prisoners spending up to 22 hours a day locked up, was a major concern. The number of deaths in custody through suicide and the suspected use of illicit drugs remained worrying, but there had been reasonable progress in improving the quality of care for prisoners in crisis or at risk of self-harm. However, the prison needed to keep recommendations from the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, or PPO, under constant review to ensure that the progress was sustained. Major investment in refurbishments on some of the older wings had delivered much needed improvement to the conditions of many showers, toilets and cells. Prisoners now had better access to basic items, such as bedding and pillows, although the prison needed to do more to sustain this advance. The prison had dealt with most of the litter and rubbish we had seen previously in the external communal areas and cell window grills. There had also been reasonable progress in the provision of healthcare. The new provider commenced just 2 weeks before this review, and it had already begun to address many of our concerns. However, it was inexcusable that Her Majesty's Prison Service had still not equipped the prison with a more up-to-date drug detection equipment. Chelmsford needed to make further reductions in the supply of drugs, a priority to safeguard prisoners' health and well-being, as well as making the prison safer by reducing violence and deaths. Consultations with prisoners had improved but needed to be more widely publicised across the prison. Some prisoners remained frustrated at their inability to gain answers to simple requests or queries. Time out of cell, although more predictable across the prison, remained very limited, particularly in the evening and at the weekends and for those not involved in purposeful activity. Despite the Governor's aspiration to provide at least 1 hour a day for outdoor exercise, most prisoners still only had 30 minutes, which was not enough. In rehabilitation and release planning, I had concerns about the delivery of the Community Rehabilitation Company contract and some key weakness in offender management arrangements. The CRC provision through the crime reduction charity shown reasonable progress with clear signs of further advances underway. There had been little development in increasing offender supervision contract with some prisoners, and the interdepartmental risk management team was not well defined and did not provide the oversight needed for high-risk prisoners being released into the community. Last year I clearly noted my confidence in the prison's capacity for change and improvement, and this was well founded. The Governor continued to set a clear vision for the prison and had retained the support of those around her. We have identified good or reasonable progress in 4 key areas, and this report makes clear what needs to be done to make advances in the remaining weak areas. The prison was inspected in August 2021, and in their report the inspectors said that Chelmsford is a Category B local prison and resettlement prison for adult and young adult men. At the time of the inspection, 712 prisoners were held in a sprawling institution, comprising older wings from the Victorian era and more modern facilities added from the late 1990s. Following this inspection, I wrote to the Secretary of State on 26 August 2021, invoking the urgent notification protocol. I set out in detail my concerns about the prison and the judgments that had caused our concerns of action. Under the protocol, the Secretary of State commits to respond publicly to the UN within 28 days, explaining how outcomes for those detained will be improved. The Secretary of State's response, for which I am grateful, is also detailed further resources for the report. We had last inspected Chelmsford Prison in June 2018 and reported our serious concerns about the conditions we found. At that time, we assessed outcomes in safety and purposeful activity as poor, our lowest assessment, and in respect, not sufficiently good. Only in rehabilitation and release planning did we judge outcomes to be reasonably good. Despite this, the then Chief Inspector was reassured by both local management and the HM prison system and probation service that they were aware of the problems at the prison and would implement strategies for improvement. Sadly, that optimism was misplaced. At this inspection, we found no improvement in outcomes in safety and purposeful activity, both of which remained poor, no improvement in respect, where outcomes remain not sufficiently good, and a deterioration in rehabilitation and release planning to not sufficiently good. In reaching these judgments, I took full account of the additional pressures placed on the prison due to COVID-19, but also the failure of the Special Measures Programme and the initiatives introduced by Her Majesty's Prison Service to drive the improvement. These had not worked. As at our last inspection in 2018, a new governor had been appointed a few months before we arrived. We were encouraged by his vision and enthusiasm for the establishment, but we were also struck by the seeming intractability of the failings at Chelmsford. The last time we were able to write a positive report about this prison was 10 years ago, and it was clear to us that the jail was failing in its basic duty to keep those it held safe. This report also highlights our concern about the negative and damaging staff culture. Many staff were new or inexperienced, their morale was low, and they were disengaged from their work and dismissive of the men in their care. Prisoners found it very difficult to access even the most basic entitlements, and were frustrated that they could not get things done. We were told that this frustration had led to an increase in assaults on staff. The negative culture among some staff was compounded by a lack of management oversight or accountability, which allowed poor staff behaviour and practice to go unchallenged. The paucity of the daily regime meant that many prisoners spent extended periods locked up and isolated in their cells. It was no surprise that many prisoners told us they felt unsafe at the prison. Such factors, combined with the inherent risk and vulnerabilities associated with Chelmsford's status as a frontline local establishment, and the failure to grip prison's problems over the recent years, meant that Chelmsford met our criteria for an urgent notification. I concluded my letter to the Secretary of State by saying that HMP Chelmsford would not improve without a sustained drive to make sure that all staff members take responsibility for creating a safer, more decent environment, a meaningful regime, and greater engagement with training and education. I argued that this will require strong and consistent leadership at all levels within the prison and much more effective support from Her Majesty's Prison Service. As we indicated in 2018 and repeat now, the drift and decline at this prison must be addressed. In accordance with the protocol between HM Chief Inspector of Prisons and the Ministry of Justice, or MOJ, I am writing to you to invoke the urgent notification process in respect of HMP and YOI Chelmsford. An unannounced inspection of the prison between the 9th and the 20th of August 2021 identified numerous significant concerns about the treatment and conditions for prisoners. This is the most recent in a series of concerning inspections over the last 7 years, and these findings were particularly disappointing bearing in mind the observations my predecessor made in 2018. At that time, the then Chief Inspector decided against instigating the UN protocol, having been persuaded that the prison had already begun to show signs of improvement under a new governor, with the support of Her Majesty's Prison Service. This latest inspection showed that these improvements have not materialised. As required by the process, I will set out in this letter the key evidence underpinning my decision to invoke the UN protocol. In addition, I attach a summary note with the main judgments from this inspection drawn from a similar document provided to the Governor at the end of the inspection last week. The Governor, the Prison Group Director, and Ministry of Justice officials have been informed of my intention to invoke the UN process. I shall, as usual, publish a full inspection report in due course. The decision to invoke the UN process is determined by my judgment, informed by relevant factors during the inspection that, as set out in the protocol between HM Chief Inspector and the MOJ, may include poor healthy prison test assessments. Inspection methodology is outlined in the HM Prison Test Inspection Framework. The pattern of the healthy prison test judgments, repeated poor assessments, the type of prison and the risk presented, the vulnerability of those detained, the failure to achieve recommendations, and the Inspectorate's confidence in the prison's capability and capacity for change and improvement. The protocol sets out that this letter will be placed in the public domain and that the Secretary of State commits to respond publicly to the concerns raised within 28 calendar days. The response will explain how outcomes for the prisoners in this institution will be improved in both the immediate and long term. The then Chief Inspector was reassured by both local management and Her Majesty's Prison Service that they were slighted on the problems at the prison and a strategy was in place. Leadership at both local and regional level readily acknowledges the gravity of the issues facing the jail, and Her Majesty's Prison Service has already placed the prison in special measures. I therefore concluded that on this occasion I had sufficient confidence in the ability of the prison to improve that I would not invoke the urgent notification protocol. At the latest inspection in August 2021, we found that the optimism had been expressed 3 years ago was misplaced. Chelmsford, like nearly all other prisons, had been hit hard by the virus, but the failings that we have identified are deep set. In addition, we were told at the 2018 inspection that Her Majesty's Prison Probation Service had in place a special measures plan of intervention for Chelmsford. This programme had, however, proven to be largely ineffective in improving outcomes. The chronic and apparently intractable failings at Chelmsford have now been evident for at least a decade, with our inspection in 2011 being the last time we felt able to report positively on the prison. It has sadly failed in its responsibility to keep prisoners safe. We have now assessed outcomes in safety as poor for 2 consecutive inspections and not sufficiently good for the 2 inspections prior to that. The prison's record in providing purposeful activity, including training and education that may equip prisoners to lead productive lives on release, is equally poor, and the prison's performance in ensuring a measure of respectful treatment is still not good enough. Even rehabilitation and release planning, a former strength, has deteriorated. Of 9 main recommendations we made 3 years ago, none has fully been achieved. These factors, combined with the inherent risks and vulnerabilities associated with Chelmsford's status as a frontline local establishment, mean the prison meets all our criteria for an urgent notification. Some of the key findings from this report revealed a dominant staff culture that is negative and damaging, and has led to the failure to promote safety, decency, or rehabilitation among prisoners. Although a few staff members we spoke to were committed and constructive, many others described very low morale, disillusionment, or disengagement. Although a few staff members we spoke to were committed and constructive, many others described very low morale, disillusionment, and disengagement. Staff members often failed to respond to even basic requests from prisoners, and too many were dismissive and showed only limited empathy and care for those whom they were responsible. Prisoners experienced real frustration in getting anything done, with leaders suggesting to us that the rise in assaults on staff was a direct result of these issues. Almost half of the prisoners in our survey said that they had been victimised by staff, particularly those with disabilities and mental health problems. Nearly a third of staff had under 2 years' experience, but they had yet to receive adequate mentoring or support. Prisoners were not sure when they would be unlocked, as the core day was not published. Often, first night cells approved for occupation by managers were by the 26th of August 2021. Emergency cell bells were often only answered after long delays. Despite our recommendations and the subsequent intervention of the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, outcomes had deteriorated. 8 self-inflicted deaths and 4 non-natural deaths had occurred since our last inspection. This is also the 4th consecutive prison inspection where we have reported increases in the rate of self-harm. We found many weaknesses in the assessment. Care in custody and teamwork, or ACCT, and other preventative processes, failing in the night safety procedures, and a lackluster approach to the use of data and action planning. Over a quarter of prisoners said that they felt unsafe at the time of this inspection, and more than half had felt unsafe at some point during their stay at Chelmsford. Analysis of data was poor, preventing a deeper understanding of risks, so it was not surprising that plans to tackle violence and improve outcomes were limited or non-existent. The lack of accountability we referred to earlier manifested itself in an over-reliance on the small safer custody team, whose work was given insufficient priority, and in failure of other staff members and senior leaders to take responsibility. At this inspection, we found many prisoners locked in their cell for almost 23 hours a day. This reflected the COVID-19 restrictions, but even in 2018, many prisoners were locked in their cell for 22 hours a day. Some restoration of education had recently begun, providing some additional activity, but a third of these places were unused. Plans to reintroduce a meaningful regime were limited and being implemented far too slowly. Chelmsford is a violent, unsafe prison, in which conditions for prisoners have declined disturbingly over recent years. despite attempts by Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service to support improvement. Many failings stem from a negative and demoralised staff culture, which results in little apparent concern for or attention to the welfare and basic needs of a complex and at times vulnerable population.